In this lesson, we're going to be carrying on where we left off at the end of the previous video, which is talking about the immediate events following the execution of Louis XVI, the trial and execution of Louis XVI. I would like to clarify, by the way, that there was a point of reference about the vote of the execution, that it was 360 to 361. It was actually 288 votes in favour of not executing the King Louis XVI. The rest of those votes, the sort of 72 votes that make up 360, were in favour of executing, but they were in favour of executing with delays and deliberations. So the sort of 360 to 361 vote that we see in favour of execution was a vote in favour of an immediate execution. It's a slight clarification that I thought would be important just to add at the beginning of this video here. It doesn't really change the general idea of the fact that there was conflict and division within the National Assembly, but it's just an interesting point to reference that it was a little bit more nuanced than I presented it in the previous video. This video is going to be focusing on the issue of the internal and external war that exists at this point in the French history. So internal war, of course, is concerning the issue of the conflict against the Girondins, the conflict between the Jacobins and the Girondins, and the Reign of Terror. The external war, of course, concerns the War of the First Coalition, and we're going to be thinking about a number of issues within this particular period. So the rising of Vendee, for example, the attempts to establish wartime control, the role of Robespierre in the establishment of the Reign of Terror, as well as the fall of the Girondins and the Federalist revolt. This is a period that takes us again from around 1792 to 1794, and this is marked by a period of, as we know already, intense internal and external conflict. So let's begin then. The spread of war is a very important point that we need to think about. Beginning first then with the fact that we still have to bear reference to the issue of external threats following the immediate execution of Louis XVI in January of 1793. So Louis XVI is executed in January 1793. The First Coalition, which is now composed of Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, among a number of other smaller nations, had declared war on France. The monarchies feared that there would be a spread of these revolutionary ideas that was the result of the collapse of the Ancien Regime, that these revolutionary ideas could also spread to their particular countries and cause a sort of European-wide continental revolution. And so the result of this is, of course, immediately beginning with the French Revolution, the Austrian Empire and the Prussian Empire declares war on France, and then with the execution of Louis XVI, we see a number of other empires joining the fold. We see Great Britain, Spain, and the Dutch also joining this particular conflict. By 1793, the French Revolutionary Wars were in full swing at this point, and France was fighting a war on multiple different fronts. When it comes to the war in the East, you have a conflict between Austria and Prussia. We see that in the West and in the South, there is conflict between Spain and Great Britain, or with Spain and Great Britain, and then in the North, you have the conflict with the Dutch. So there is a multi-front conflict that is taking place among the French within the First Coalition, or the French Revolutionary Wars, as they are also known. In addition to the external threats that are sort of permeating this entire period, you also have domestic conflict. Firstly, you have the struggle of the revolutionary government. As France was beginning to fight on multiple different fronts, the revolutionary government began to struggle when it came to the internal maintenance of control. The chaos that was compounded by economic instability, inflation, and food shortages would be driving mass discontent. The Girondins, for example, advocated for war as a means of uniting the country, as well as spreading revolutionary ideas. But the failure of a number of early campaigns in the conflict itself, such as defeats against the Austrian and Prussian armies, revealed that France was in a particularly weak position internationally. In addition to this, you also have the Committee of Public Safety. This was a committee that is led by Maximilien Robespierre, who essentially was tasked with the job of centralizing power and trying to manage the wartime efforts as well as internal control. The committee's goal was to protect the revolution. This would be by any means necessary. And so the result of this is it would eventually start to include the use of force against internal dissent, against the revolution. One such event that we see takes place around here is the rising of Vendee. The Vendee was a rural region in western France, home to quite a deeply conservative population. This deeply conservative population would be remaining loyal to both the monarchy, but also to the Catholic Church. The revolutionary government's policies, including things like the civil constitution of the clergy, which, if you remember back from previous lessons, essentially subordinated the church to the state. You also see, of course, the nationalization of church property, as well as the levée en masse, which was also viewed as a direct threat to traditional rural life, all therefore started to rebel against the revolutionary government itself. And so we see in March of 1793 the Vendee uprising. This is a rebellion that began as a response specifically to the conscription, to the levée en masse, and to the religious persecution that was imposed by the revolutionary government. The uprising itself would escalate into a widespread counter-revolutionary revolt. We see that rebels, mostly peasants and royalist sympathizers, calling for the restoration of both the monarchy but also the restoration of the Catholic faith. They were led by a number of royalist generals and other local figures who sought to return to the pre-revolutionary system, the order of the prior to the French Revolution. It would grow into a full-scale civil war between the Republican Army and a number of the royalist rebels. So this was more than a mere small-scale event or small-scale uprising. This began as a small-scale uprising, as a sort of small-scale rebellion, and ended up into a full-scale civil war between these two particular factions. The Republican response was to impose extreme measures to try and suppress the Vendee uprising. So the National Convention responded with these extreme measures. They used both military force as well as political repression. The Republican armies specifically would conduct brutal campaigns against the rebels. They would burn villages, they would execute prisoners, and they would carry out a number of massacres. The uprising also was eventually crushed by the Republican forces, but the purpose of thinking about the uprising is less to think about the general events that preceded and led to the Vendee uprising, but to speak about the internal divisions that were demonstrated by the uprising between and divisions within French society. Large portions of the rural population, for example, rejected the revolutionary government. And this becomes problematic when you're fighting a war on three fronts against a number of different empires in Europe. You need to have a sort of united front against these particular enemies in the War of the First Coalition, something that the revolutionary government did not have, because the revolutionary government had to also fight the internal divisions within the sort of countryside of royalist rebels who opposed their rule and opposed the destruction of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. So with all this in mind then, what were the ways in which we see attempts at least to establish control during the war itself? Well, the first thing that we can obviously mention is something that we've spoken about already, the levée en masse, which is the 1793 National Conscription Plan. The revolution's leaders were recognizing that there was critical issues relating to both wars at home and abroad, and so they moved to establish wartime control over the economy, over the military, and over society. The levée en masse is an example of this. They aim to mobilize all able-bodied men for the war effort itself. The policy was necessary, according to the revolutionaries, for the survival of the revolution, but the problem that it had was it led to significant unrest, again, as we mentioned earlier on, when we talk about the rural areas that were associated with the sort of royalist sympathies. The Republic also started to centralize power. This was represented, as I've mentioned earlier on in this video, by the Committee of Public Safety. It was given unprecedented powers to oversee the war effort, but also to oversee internal security. It was a committee that, as I've mentioned already, was led by Maximilien Robespierre, but it also included a number of very prominent radical revolutionary figures. People like Georges Danton, for example, and Louis Antoine de Saint-Just, who also was a very prominent figure, and again, whose last name I've probably also butchered in the process of trying to do French pronunciations. But specifically, some of the things that the centralization of power involved, and specifically the Committee of Public Safety involved, was the implementing of emergency measures. Robespierre began to implement these measures to try and centralize the revolution. This included the distribution of food, this included the imposition of price controls, but also it began to include the state control of the economy. We essentially go on to a wartime economy as the result of this particular committee. The committee also would take quite harsh action against suspected enemies of the revolution. This, of course, institutes the reign of terror that we are sort of in the midst of at the moment. And it's important that when we think about the Committee of Public Safety, and when we think about the centralization of power, at this point it's important to mention a little bit more specifically the role of Maximilien Robespierre and the rise of the Jacobin group within the Reign of Terror. Robespierre would emerge as the leader of the Jacobins. The Jacobins, of course, were the radical faction that advocated for the execution of the king, as well as the creation of a republic based on revolutionary ideals. Now, Robespierre's philosophy specifically was rooted in his belief in virtue and the idea of a general will. He argued that, for example, the revolution needs to be protected at all costs, even if this would mean the use of quite extreme measures, such as the purging of political enemies and the implementation of terror. And essentially, this idea of implementation of terror and the sort of general philosophy of Robespierre would be elucidated by the Committee of Public Safety. It would be elucidated by the committee that essentially was able to, that Robespierre was able to wield significant influence in directing the course of the revolution, particularly during this period of the Reign of Terror. It was a period during which the committee would use extreme measures to control internal dissent, to suppress counter-revolutionary activity, and to ensure the loyalty of the revolutionary cause. A number of revolutionary tribunals would be established during this period. This would be to try the enemies of the revolution, and it would include the primary instrument of execution, which was, of course, the guillotine. Thousands of enemies who were, or at least quote-unquote enemies, people who were perceived to be enemies, were arrested and executed. This included a number of members of the nobility, members of the clergy, a number of political rivals, as well as former revolutionaries who were seen as too compromising on the revolution's purity. This brings us to the issue of the Girondins and their fall from position. If you remember back to previous lessons, the Girondins were a moderate revolutionary faction, and they supported the war against the monarchies abroad, but then they opposed the radical measures of the Jacobins, people who opposed, for example, the issue of the execution of the king. Initially, they were in favor of the war, the Girondins, but then they started to disagree with how the Jacobins would be conducting the revolution, and they started to disagree with just how far they were going to go in terms of radical measures against counter-revolutionaries and against anybody who was perceived as too moderate. This would ultimately be their undoing, as the revolutionary government began to face growing increase in terms of crisis, the Jacobins would increasingly turn on the Girondins. They would be viewed as obstacles to the radical goals of the revolutions rather than being supporters of the revolution itself. This leads in June 1793 to the Purge of the Girondins. The National Convention in this month would expel them from power, accusing them of being counter-revolutionary and traitors, and they would form part of the victimhood of the Reign of Terror, just like the counter-revolutionaries. Many of the leaders of the Girondins were arrested and then were later executed. This would mark a shift towards a quite significant amount of Jacobin radical control. In 1793, then, we also get the final issue that we're going to talk about in this lesson, which is the Federalist revolt. With the Girondins' expulsion, we see the development of widespread discontent. Remember, the Girondins was quite a major player within the National Convention. And so when we think about the different provinces, many cities and regions, including Lyon and Marseille and Bordeaux, also started to revolt against the radical centralization of power by the Jacobins. This becomes known as the Federalist Revolt. It was driven by the opposition to the Jacobin-led National Convention, as well as the policies that were being implemented by said National Convention. The Federalists favoured a decentralization of government, and they also opposed the Reign of Terror. However, unfortunately, the rebellion, the Federalist Revolt, would be crushed by the revolutionary government. Several cities were brutally suppressed, and this again contributed to a deepening civil war within France, alongside the war of the First Coalition that is running against the French and against the French Revolution itself. This is really marking the significant period that I've noted already when we think about just how radical and deep into this radicalization that the French government would start to go. The National Convention ran by the Jacobins. From the period, therefore, between 1793 and 1794, we see a quite intense amount of internal and external strife. This essentially tested the Republic's survival. On the one hand, we of course have the European powers and the external wars with them. You also have the Vendee Revolution, the Federalist Revolt, and the ideas that were pushed by Robespierre, essentially to try and implement emergency wartime measures. The fall of the Girondins would eventually mark the victory of the radicals within the factions of the National Assembly. It would also mark a significant rise in the power and influence of Robespierre, which culminates in the Reign of Terror. And so what we see here is the beginnings of, or at least the sort of midst of the Reigns of Terror itself, the radicalization of the revolution, leading to eventually the internal conflicts which would end up with the downfall of Robespierre himself in 1794. And we'll see that this starts to take place as we start to think about the development of the Terror and the Levée en masse and the implementation of the Levée en masse and the progress of the war of the First Coalition. We're going to speak about all of this in the next lesson.